WBC belt that has included Ali, the greatest of all time. They are set and ready to answer who's the greatest of right now. Wilder, Fury 2, here we go.
News! Okay, we'll start with this. I'm sure that most of you have heard by now, per tweet from Michael Benson. Canelo and Golden Boy are reportedly in a heated dispute with DAZN. It's claimed there is doubt he'll fight this year, as DAZN underwhelmed with matchups he's had on the platform so far. Note Triple G trilogy. And so are refusing to pay his $35 million guarantee, according to The Athletic Box. The Athletic Box says DAZN is looking for a premier opponent for Canelo Alvarez next. The streaming service does not view Callum Smith or Billy Joe Saunders as that. There's a bigger problem here that isn't being addressed. A bigger problem that has everything to do with why things are working out the way they're working out. DAZN feels that they're not getting their money's worth for Canelo Alvarez.
But it's just not showing up in the numbers.
In turn, the people over there at Golden Boy, they want DAZN to honor the contract. We agreed on a set amount per fight, and that's what we want when our guy fights.
All right.
Point blank, period. Who's right and who's wrong here? What's not being said, what's not being discussed by any of these pundits, any of these YouTube channels, in reference to the rather tedious situation between Golden Boy, Canelo, and DAZN, is that Canelo Alvarez's fights don't have an air of intrigue, and that's why it's not showing up in the numbers. I don't necessarily think that DAZN is right to renege on what Canelo Alvarez should be making fight by fight. You guys agreed on a set amount. You have to deliver the same way you expect him to deliver.
Pay the man.
Though I am not unsympathetic to DAZN's plight, perhaps paying the man isn't as easy to do in the thick of what is a global pandemic, at a time where we're transitioning out of it, trying to regain some sense of normalcy, bringing boxing back to the boxing fans. $35 million a fight for this guy might be a little bit hard to come by. Maybe that's the case. I don't doubt that, and I'm not unsympathetic towards it. However, I can't stress enough that a big part of the problem, and what's not being said, is that Canelo Alvarez's fights have no air of intrigue. How intriguing was the Rocky Fielding fight, you understand?
Yeah.
The Daniel Jacobs fight, that was a quality matchup. I enjoyed that fight. I was entertained by it, but there was no intrigue, you understand. Canelo Alvarez was the favorite to win, rightfully so. That's what the performances showed us, and there was nothing intriguing about that fight. The Sergey Kovalev fight, same thing, you know?
Another one.
Granted that Sergey probably stood a better chance of knocking out a Canelo Alvarez than some other fighters, at least more so than a Rocky Fielding or a Daniel Jacobs, but Canelo Alvarez was still the logical choice in that situation. He was still the favorite, and that in and of itself lacked an air of intrigue. What DAZN wants is the air of intrigue that we saw ahead of the first Golovkin fight. The air of intrigue we're seeing here ahead of the Teofimo Lopez versus Vasyl Lomachenko fight. That air of intrigue to where something spontaneous, something unexpected could happen, and that
sells,
draws eyes, that draws attention. Many of you out there might find it interesting to hear that DAZN doesn't view Billy Joe Saunders or Callum Smith as premier opponents, in spite of those opponents being undefeated champions in the super middleweight division.
They don't?
But why? Why is that? What do Billy Joe Saunders, Callum Smith really have in common? These are two different fighters that operate in two very different ways. Billy Joe Saunders, a two-division champion, a southpaw, crafty, good set of legs when he wants to use them. Callum Smith, very big guy, statuesque for the weight, strong puncher.
Yeah, sometimes.
He's less of a back foot guy than Billy is.
What do they have in common?
That they're both from the UK?
Well, they are.
But that's not necessarily it. That's not necessarily what I'm getting at. Though they are both from the United Kingdom, and they do have that in common. What I'm getting at, what I'm referring to, is that Canelo Alvarez would be the favorite to beat either of those two guys. And that is what they have in common. Whether it's Billy Joe Saunders or Callum Smith, Canelo is the favorite. Canelo's the favorite. There's not much air of intrigue in those matchups, in spite of those matchups being high-quality fights between high-quality fighters. Billy Joe Saunders, Callum Smith, they're both world champions. They're both unbeaten. These are the two best scalps, two of the best scalps, that Canelo Alvarez could collect in the super middleweight division. And DAZN,
They don't view them as premier fights.
and if they don't view these two unbeaten champions as premier fights, premier scalps that Canelo Alvarez could collect, who do they consider a premier fighter? Gennady Golovkin. Why do you think they've been pushing that agenda, pushing that narrative this whole time? They really want that Golovkin fight because they feel that's going to drive up subscriptions. Perhaps it might.
Golovkin's gonna get knocked the fuck out in that fight.
I mean, I think he is. I do. And I think the prospect of that, while nowhere near as intriguing as the air we saw ahead of the first fight, is still intriguing enough that it would draw more eyes than a Kovalev fight, than a Jacobs fight, and then a Fielding fight. If I told you, hey,
And you want to see Golovkin get the shit beat out of him this Saturday?
Yeah! Goddamn right I do. You better sign me up, brother.
the problem with that is it takes two to tango, and right now, Golovkin didn't bring his damn shoes. He's more focused on this Camille Zeremata fight. I think the fundamental mistake that DAZN made was having so much invested in Canelo versus Golovkin 3 without making that a part of the contract language.
We knew that was their bottom line.
And we knew that's what they wanted. I just don't think that they got it in writing. Writing from Canelo Alvarez, writing from Gennady Golovkin, that both sides, both fighters, have made a commitment to have this fight within an allotted time frame. You didn't actually book the fight. You merely assumed that by procuring both fighters on your platform, the fight would happen by itself. It's gotta happen.
And maybe it will.
But not when you want it to. First, Golovkin was on board, but Canelo was not. Then, Canelo was on board, but Golovkin is not. And here we are.
You should have got it in writing.
And I don't think they did. It seems that anything short of that third fight is small potatoes to DAZN, and they don't want to put the money up. Perhaps what they're telling themselves is, if we give Canelo Alvarez $35 million to fight Billy or Callum, we end up losing money. It costs us more money to send this guy out there against those guys than if we didn't send him out there at all. Sounds a lot like what they're basically saying is that unless it's Gennady Golovkin 3, they ain't paying and they ain't playing.
That rhymed.
It did, and I'm not sure what's going to happen with this. How long is Canelo Alvarez and Golden Boy willing to wait? Who's gonna fold? Who's gonna buckle? Only time will tell. Moving on to heavyweight news. Triple H of the WWE had this to say. He says, Tyson Fury versus Drew McIntyre is a mega fight. Breaks records. And myself, I don't keep up with the WWE as much as I used to back when it was called the WWF. Admittedly, I was a raging Hulkamaniac in my day. Subsequently became a Steve Austin guy, a Stone Cold guy in the Attitude Era of the WWE. Better still, I don't keep up with it as much as I used to, but I noticed a proliferation of stories involving Tyson Fury and Drew McIntyre, and I thought to myself, all these call-outs that Tyson Fury has been making of Anthony Joshua, a boxer, not a WWE superstar, to perhaps lock horns with him in December before the year is out, are call-outs that I interpreted as hollow. Call-outs that I've no stock in. That Tyson Fury would sooner lock horns with Drew McIntyre in December before he'd lock horns with Anthony Joshua. Because Tyson Fury knows, like you know, like I know, like we all fucking know, that fight is not feasible in that time frame, within that time frame. Tyson Fury knows this, yet he insists on making these unrealistic propositions, and I thought to myself, you know what this guy's doing? He's just keeping his name out there, self-promoting, keeping the conversation alive, whilst having intentions of perhaps fighting someone else or participating in something else. You'll recall that Tyson Fury said that he's going to make a ring return, with or without Deontay Wilder, before the year is out. A ring return. Perhaps not a boxing ring, but a wrestling ring. If I'm being honest, I have nothing against Tyson Fury exploring other arms of revenue, alternative options to a boxing match to make himself some coin before the year is out, so that the year itself isn't a complete wash. I have nothing against Tyson Fury doing this, but I do have something against the divisive nature of his call-outs. Don't call the AJ guy out trying to fool the boxing community that fight could happen in December when you know it won't. Don't do this when you have intentions of doing something else entirely that doesn't involve AJ and doesn't even involve boxing. I'd sooner believe that the whole time Tyson Fury's been making these propositions of fighting AJ in December, what he's actually had in mind is another appearance the WWE.
That's what I think.
As if the obstacles in the sport of boxing aren't enough indication of this, the fact he's calling out Drew McIntyre here and now,
That tells the story.
and that tells you who he really means to return to the ring against in 2020, before the year is out. Drew McIntyre, in all likelihood, is likely who he was talking about, who Frank was talking about. And they said that Tyson Fury wasn't going to wait to return to action. He wasn't going to wait for Wilder to return to the ring. They just didn't say that they meant the wrestling ring, not the boxing ring. We will see if time proves me right, and it's Drew McIntyre that Tyson Fury fights before this year is out. We'll find out one way or another. But I told you, I have no stock in Tyson Fury's call-outs of Anthony Joshua to fight in December. He knows that fight can't happen within that time frame, and we all know it. And finally, you might have heard news break yesterday via Mike Kopinger that Luis Ortiz will fight journeyman Scott Alexander this fall in his first bout since a knockout loss to Deontay Wilder in their rematch. IDEC Boxing reports that the heavyweight bout is expected to land November 7th on the PBC on Fox undercard of Andy Ruiz versus Chris Arreola. Essentially, what both Andy and Luis are doing is tuning up, taking on some keep busy fights, as both of these fighters are coming off of losses. Andy Ruiz's one-sided decision loss to Anthony Joshua, and Luis Ortiz's second knockout loss to Deontay Wilder. It's understandable why they're taking on these kinds of fights, so I have no criticisms there. Luis Ortiz actually wanted to fight Andy Ruiz straight away, at least based on what he was saying. He was saying he doesn't need a tune-up, but for some reason Andy wants one. Here we are. I believe that what's happening here is the fight is being built between these two fighters. A fight is being built between Andy Ruiz and Luis Ortiz. And in truth, it's not a bad fight. It just depends on how it's billed, how it's marketed. If you try to sell me this fight as a pay-per-view, we're going to have some serious fucking problems.
This ain't no $80 fight.
It's not. It's just not. There is an air of intrigue associated with the fight. There is an air of intrigue associated with a Ruiz versus Ortiz heavyweight contest, as the outcome isn't quite crystal clear. You could argue that even at this age, Luis Ortiz has a better set of legs to navigate the ring than Andy Ruiz ever had. Andy Ruiz, who's supposed to be, at least on paper, 11 years younger than the 41-year-old Luis Ortiz, though some people speculate he's actually much older than that. I'll say that power counterpunching really would have to go to Andy Ruiz, that if you let this guy get in his sweet spot, he's actually quite lethal. That's mid-range to inside. The problem is that he doesn't have the best legs to get him there. Enter the Cuban school boxing of Luis Ortiz, who for the most part has always had a better set of legs than Andy and could fight this fight behind his straight punches from the outside, unless we forget Luis Ortiz is a southpaw. That in and of itself has a habit of flustering some orthodox fighters. I think it's possible, I don't think it's far-fetched to say that maybe Luis Ortiz is the more polished of the two boxers in this boxing match, though Andy, as funny as this might sound, is the better physical specimen. I think Andy Ruiz has a better chin, takes a better punch than Luis Ortiz. I think he packs a bigger punch than Luis Ortiz as well. I think mid-range to inside, Andy Ruiz has a speed advantage. I'd trust Andy to hit Luis Ortiz with a shot that he doesn't see coming more than I trust Luis to do the same thing.
Andy's biggest hindrance are his feet.
He's got slow feet. He's a flat-footed fighter. That has its pros, that has its cons. You know, standing on your whole foot does allow you to generate a lot of power to really sit on those punches, but it does come at the cost of your mobility. The thing is, you know, Andy's with Eddie Reynoso now. We haven't quite had the chance to see what effect being with Eddie Reynoso, that entire team, that's Canelo, that's Ryan Garcia, that's Oscar Valdez. Those are the guys that Eddie Reynoso is training. Those are the guys under his wing. Andy Ruiz is among them, and we haven't yet had the chance to see what effect, if any, that's having on Andy. Is it possible that now that he's with Eddie, maybe we get a more athletic, fleet of foot Andy Ruiz who's more capable of cutting off the ring?
Glenbow steaks.
What the hell are you talking about? What are you trying to imply? The point is that Andy Ruiz has found himself a new trainer, and for what it's worth, it's a pretty darn good trainer. So maybe we don't see the Andy Ruiz that we've been seeing up until this point. We'll find out the night of the Chris Arreola fight, though in truth, and I've said this before, no matter what Andy goes out there and does to Chris Arreola, we can't read too much into it because it's Chris Arreola.
Yeah.
The litmus test, the real litmus test for where Andy Ruiz is now that he's with Eddie Reynoso, for better or worse, will be the Luis Ortiz fight. That's the fight that'll tell us whether Andy is better or worse under the tutelage of Eddie Reynoso. It is an intriguing fight. I'm not going to shit all over it just because it's a PBC fight. You know, it's a good fight. I just don't think it should be billed as a pay-per-view. Not a standalone pay-per-view. I mean, that can't be the main event with a weak undercard. Now, maybe if you deck out the undercard the way they did for that Charlo doubleheader, maybe then you're cooking with rice. So Luis Ortiz, he's supposed to be fighting this Scott guy. Nothing against him, God bless him, but the most recognizable name on Scott's CV is Travis Kaufman, and it just so happens that he lost to Travis Kaufman. He's got a professional record of 16 wins, 3 losses, and 2 draws. No notariable wins of any kind. Essentially, Luis Ortiz is going to look like he's found the fountain of youth against this Scott Alexander guy. That's going to be the look of it, because they're building Luis Ortiz back up for the Ruiz fight. The marketing here is obvious. And, you know, Luis is coming off that very violent knockout loss, so it's an evil, yeah, but it's a necessary evil, especially for a 41-year-old fighter, assuming he's not older than that. I understand the rhyme and the reason for it. I'm not even complaining. I'm just saying that if Luis goes out there and looks unstoppable, that has more to do with Scott Alexander's shortcomings than Luis Ortiz's condition. Luis Ortiz ain't in his 40s the way that Alexander Povetkin is in his 40s, the way he weathered 2 knockdowns against the top 10 heavyweight, came back, and knocked him the fuck out, you know. This is what Luis Ortiz is doing. We can expect this in November.